Welcome everyone to the 7th seminar of our seminar series, African Consumers and the 19th Century Global Economy. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our today's speaker, who is a colleague and friend from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, Frederick. Kate is an assistant professor and she is an economic historian specializing in industrial development in sub-Saharan Africa from the late pre-colonial to the early post-colonial period, with a special focus on East Africa. Kate obtained her PhD in economic history in 2018 from Wageningen University, still in the Netherlands. And the monograph that derived from her PhD thesis was published in 2020 and was titled Deindustrialization in East Africa, Textile Production in an Era of Globalization and Colonization, 1830-1930. And this monograph has been awarded the International Economic History Association Dissertation Prize at the World Economic History Congress. From 2018, Kate was affiliated with the ERC project Race to the Bottom, Family Labor, Household Livelihood and Consumption in the Relocation of Global Cotton Manufacturing at the University of Utrecht. And today, as part of our seminar series, Kate will present a paper titled Post-Colonial Threats, Colonial Era Demand Patterns and the Dynamics of Early Industrialization in East Africa. So thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being part of this seminar series. And the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that very nice introduction, Karin. And also for inviting me to join the seminar series and the impending book project on African consumerism. I'm very much looking forward to this. So yeah, today I'm actually presenting some, I would say, very exploratory preliminary work, which in some ways sort of connects very well with my previous work, which was very much focused on the colonial period, but is also a bit new for me because it moves into the post-colonial period, which is a sort of newer realm. I have focused in the past largely on the disappearance of handicraft textile manufacturing in East Africa, and I'm moving into sort of thinking about how colonial era developments affected post-colonial efforts to stimulate modern manufacturing. So when we say modern manufacturing, of course, we mean sort of factory-based, capital-intensive production. So this is quite a different beast, I would say. And in a way, it's a little bit, elements of it are outside of the scope of the African Consumerism Project, but what I want to argue for is a sort of closer link between developments in consumerism in the 19th century and certain choices that were made in the post-colonial period. So some bits of this will sort of step out of the 19th century, like quite a lot of this will step out of the 19th century sort of framework that we're working with for the seminar series and the book project. So I would really appreciate your feedback on kind of where to focus my attention for my chapter in the edited volume. But since I was given 45 minutes, which I probably will not fill, I will be a bit broader here. So it will be a bit of a bigger story. So disclaimer finished. I will start now with my story. So to give a bit of background, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda ended the colonial era with very little in the way of modern manufacturing, including textiles. But in the early post-colonial period, all three of these newly independent countries attempted to industrialize rapidly using import substitution industrialization, or ISI, basically in which countries prohibit imports of manufactured goods in order to develop their own industries that serve domestic consumer markets. But the production strategies and the outcomes in these three countries differed. Partly, I will argue, based on developments during the colonial era. And I have two major aims here with this research. The first is to try to explore this link between colonial demand patterns and production. and post-colonial production choices and strategies, which have largely been treated kind of separately in the literature, despite what I see as sort of clear connections between these. The second aim is to think about what the real implications of these production choices were for the success of industrial development in the three countries. And I'm using a wide array of sources here, including colonial trade data, post-colonial development plans, annual economic surveys, industrial censuses, loads of correspondences between government agencies, particularly within Kenya, and correspondences between manufacturers and these government agencies, along with a variety of commissioned reports from international organizations and even newspaper articles discussing industrial development in the post-colonial period. Now, what's nice about some of these sources, especially the government documents, is that they have been only kind of relatively recently opened after a 25-year moratorium on confidential correspondences. So given that much of the research done on post-colonial industrialization was carried out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it might be possible to sort of get some fresh insights from these new documents. I will also say that the emphasis is a bit more on Kenya in the research currently, and this is for a very practical reason. I was easily able to access the Kenya National Archives, whereas I have not been able to get into, well, the Tanzania archives, quite difficult, or Uganda as well. So in the long run, I would very much like to kind of balance out these sources. Fortunately, a lot of the documents that I could get my hands on in Kenya gave a sort of perspective of the of developments across the so-called East African community. But of course, we have to keep in mind bias. I mean, these are Kenyan sources. Okay, so why do I think it is so exciting and interesting to shift my focus to textile production in the early post-colonial years? Well, I have sort of three kind of tangible reasons. First of all, this is really a crucial moment of potential growth in sub-Saharan Africa, including East Africa. It is the moment that coincides with successful industrial development in East Asia. And it also precedes, and as I will show, in some ways really affects the political and economic turmoil that's going to unfold in East Africa, especially between states in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's sort of this moment of possibility, I would say. And indeed, we can see here in table one that there's really a pronounced growth of manufacturing in the early 1960s, just after independence, that starts to taper off and in some cases even reverse in the 1970s and 1980s. And in general, we can see Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, which are at the top here in bold, a considerable difference with Kenya doing much better in both the shorter and the longer term. So that is sort of going to play into the story that I want to tell here. And textiles are going to play a particularly key role in this manufacturing development that we see. East African textile manufacturing, at least in terms of modern manufacturing, was virtually non-existent in the 1950s. We can see here 1953, 1954, nothing was being produced. But then when we fast forward into the 60s, we see a jump up of 38.5 million square yards. This is, of course, still kind of a drop in the bucket if we compare to the square yards of imported textiles coming into East Africa, but we do see that there is this uptick in growth. Secondly, this provides an excellent opportunity to bring in what I consider to be the missing consumer when we talk about ISI. Consumer demand has a strong role in shaping industrial outcomes, and it's generally kind of ignored in analyses of, let's say, the failures of ISI in the Global South. This is really anywhere that we're talking about in the Global South. But this is a mistake, I think, because textiles are really the main import during the colonial period. And as a result of that, they become the main consumer good that is produced under ISI. And we already know from colonial scholarship, I think you've already heard from Jeremy in Pressold in this series, um, that discerning consumers in East Africa could really shape industrial developments even in other parts of the world. So understanding that relationship between consumer demand and industrial choices that are being made in East Africa, I think is very important. Meanwhile, most of the explanations for the failure or success, but usually failure of ISI focus on so-called supply side issues. So we can think about unfavorable post-colonial economic conditions like low skill levels or scarce resources or dependence on foreign capital. We can think about trade conflicts or government policies that result in inefficient firms. And if these theorists do consider domestic demand, it's usually only relating to the overall size of the domestic market. Is there a big enough domestic market to sort of feed these industrial products into, rather than considering a match, or as I will argue, a mismatch between the qualitative consumer preferences, so the goods consumers actually want, and the products being supplied under ISI. So this is what I want to bring attention to, the sort of central role of the consumer in helping to determine whether ISI can work or not. And this, I argue, was really kind of ignored, but as a result of a kind of colonial path dependency in East Africa. So this will hopefully become more clear as I explain a bit more. Finally, I think that this can actually bring some lessons for the present. Of course, we're talking about the 60s and the 70s here, but ISI is experiencing a sort of resurgence in popularity in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are lessons to be learned from this first wave. And I think in particular, this connection between product supply and consumer demand is especially important given that the new ISI strategies that governments are interested in pursuing are geared towards supplying a growing middle class with particular and sort of changing consumer preferences. So I see some sort of parallels here that are developing. So as you can see, this is a sort of longer term perspective, linking the colonial period with the early post-colonial period and even thinking forward into the present. Okay, so now on to the case studies themselves, which are obviously interlinking due to their shared proximity. I mean, they're really neighboring each other in East Africa, as well as a shared colonial heritage. So Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, or well, Tanganyika, we could say in the colonial period, were partially integrated as British colonies neighboring each other with a shared customs union and services. And importantly for our story, toward the later years of colonial rule, there was even a move to start to coordinate industrial development between the three colonies under the East African Common Services Organization. Now, when they became independent in the early 1960s, they strengthened that existing integration with the founding of the East African Community, which included a common market. And a common market is, of course, very important given that all three member states were simultaneously starting ISI strategies that rely on domestic markets. So this is important to keep in mind, that they were considering sort of sharing markets, but at the same time, there's going to be competition between them. But as I think many of us already know, almost as soon as the East African Community is founded, cooperation starts to unravel due to, well, a variety of issues, including economic imbalances, given that Kenya is really an economic frontrunner, as well as some really fundamental ideological differences between socialist Tanzania, more liberal Kenya, and sort of more chaotic policy under Idi Amin in Uganda. So that by 1977, the East African Community is dissolved. And it's kind of within this sort of backdrop that we are thinking about this industrial development. So looking back to their kind of colonial pasts, despite this shared British colonial heritage, the three cases have very significant differences in their colonial histories. They have different post-colonial economic characteristics as a result, and very different industrial starting points. So beginning with Kenya, this is a former settler colony with considerable British investment in the region, making it essentially the economic leader of the three in the late colonial period. And this in turn makes it more attractive for foreign capital investment in industry in Kenya. And it's also welcomed by the Kenyan government sort of more readily compared to, say, Tanzania, which really sort of eschews foreign investment in many ways. As a result, Kenya basically starts the post-colonial period with a stronger general industrial foundation, for example, in food processing and machinery. But interestingly, as we'll see, Kenya would actually have quite a later start in textile manufacturing, and that's going to play an important role in the sort of choices that Kenya is able to make. Now, both Uganda and Tanzania, in contrast, were former non-settler colonies that were less wealthy in comparative terms than Kenya, and heavily focused on a few agricultural exports, particularly cotton, which is, of course, very important when we're talking about textile production. They also have less access to foreign capital, as I mentioned, partly because Tanzania, which takes a socialist bent, really actively sort of rejects the idea of foreign direct investment and declares self-reliance in 1967 with the Arusha Declaration. So this is also a difference with Kenya. But what's quite interesting is that despite this sort of, I would say, weaker economic foundation from the start of the post-colonial period, it is actually Uganda and Tanzania that have a head start first in textile manufacturing. So by 1965, the production estimates were that Kenya was only producing 3.6 million square yards compared with Tanzania's 13.4, and Uganda's quite impressive 27.5 million square yards. But in the long run, despite this sort of slower start, Kenya fares better. So it's a bit that puzzle that I want to work out. What is going on there? So the three countries initially make an effort to work together to share the larger East African market by specializing in particular types of textiles, based on the recommendation of external advisory boards, like we see here, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which in the mid-1960s basically suggested, quote, textile perspectives in the sub-region must contend with the vast range of heterogeneity in end products, and therefore recognize the near impossibility of reaching national self-sufficiency in country markets. The development of textile industries cannot possibly reach the highest levels of development except on a joint pooled basis. So ostensibly, they decide to do this with the Kampala Agreement of 1964. Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania basically sort of make agreements about which countries will focus on which products. Uganda and Tanzania agree that they will focus primarily on basic natural fibers, specifically producing so-called cotton, gray cotton cloth, unbleached cloth, which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment when I go back to the colonial period. Meanwhile, Kenya agrees to kind of limit cotton manufacturing and instead focus on the production of rayon and synthetics. So this is a kind of background of what's going on in the post-colonial period. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on the causes, the benefits, and some of the drawbacks of these specialization choices, which I'm going to argue have really strong links to colonial era developments. So what are the colonial roots here? Well, the choice of specialization definitely had its roots in the colonial period. Already in the 1960s, government officials were considering their industrial choices, and it was noted that some years ago, the pre-independence Kenya government decided, possibly wrongly, to place an emphasis on rayon and synthetic production while Uganda and Tanzania concentrated on cotton. So why were these colony level decisions being made during the colonial period? And were they indeed wrong in the long run? So we're going to sort of take a step back in time now. So we'll look at colonial production and consumption patterns that really inform these choices. And starting off with production patterns, that is the exports that were coming out of these countries. We can see here that at the time that Uganda and Tanzania were deciding to focus on the manufacture of cotton cloth, it seemed to make good sense for them. This was partly rooted in the very different agricultural developments that were taking place in colonial East Africa, with Uganda and colonial Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was called then, producing very considerable amounts of raw cotton, which were being exported. So we see in Figure 1 that between 1920 and the end of the 1950s, there is this enormous takeoff in the export of raw cotton, starting first with Uganda, but Tanzania quickly starting to catch up. And then we can see in Table 3, which actually shows the value of raw cotton exports for each of the three colonies, that Kenya's production is much lower. Between 1946 and 1963, it jumps from 41,000 to 437,000, but that is virtually nothing in comparison to the incredible amounts of cotton being produced and exported by Uganda and Tanzania. And if we're thinking in terms of domestic input supplies, then cotton cloth obviously makes great sense for Tanzania and Uganda, and much less so for Kenya. So that is one of the sort of, I think, colonial roots to this decision that is being made. How do we sort of stimulate industrial development on the basis of the agricultural products that we produce? So then if we turn to what I think are sort of the more exciting consumption patterns that influence these decisions, things start to get, I think, a little bit more interesting. What we're looking at here are the cloth exports to East Africa from Bombay in India during the 19th century. And we can see that these exports were heavily dominated by unbleached or so-called gray cloth and other plain varieties like bleached cloth. This is really going to dominate East African markets through the colonial period. In fact, this gray unbleached cloth made up the single most important imported good into East Africa throughout the colonial period. It was used in the economy in a variety of ways. It was used as a currency in the interior of East Africa. It served as a store of wealth on the coast. It was hand printed, embellished, and worn locally. So it was a very important player in the economy. That's not to say that patterned cloth, so more complex varieties, weren't imported and used, but simply that in terms of scale, unbleached cloth was a much bigger player in the economy. And the situation sort of remains fairly stable into the later era of the colonial period. But then, in the 1940s and 1950s, supplies of this very important material are significantly curtailed as Indian exports into East Africa become severely constrained. So we see here in a letter to the Commerce and Industry Secretariat in Nairobi that supplies of cloth for the East African market from India are exceedingly difficult, providing approximately only 3 yards per head of the population instead of the minimum requirement of 12 yards. Now, there are a number of reasons that this becomes constrained, but it is arguably beyond the scope of this paper. There are loads of developments going on in India at this time and within the sort of broader colonial economy of the British. But suffice it to say, this shortage of unbleached cloth, which is so key to the East African economy, is going to have an impact on the colonial government. which notes that diminished supplies of cloth in East Africa are really causing considerable economic turmoil. So it's within exactly this context that the colonial government decides in 1954 to grant the first industrial textile license in East Africa. This goes to Uganda, where there is, of course, a considerable cotton supply. So you can see sort of why these kind of threads of the colonial past are influencing what will happen in the early industrial phase. Now, the initial choice of what Uganda will produce in textile factories is heavily influenced by demand preferences in the late colonial period, as of the early 1950s. These are demand preferences that go all the way back to the 19th century period when we see that rise in demand for unbleached cloth. Now, these import figures, which we see here, show imports in 1946 into East Africa. And unfortunately, you see in 1946, Kenya and Uganda are still aggregated, whereas in 63, they are disaggregated. But we can still see an overall picture of the actual composition of the cloth that is being imported into East Africa. So I would say that these figures provide two key insights. The first takeaway is that given this enormous jump in East African textile consumption by the end of the colonial period, which we can see here, the decision to pursue ISI-based textile manufacturing is completely understandable. It seems like a good deal. Success, however, and this is really the key, depended on the capacity of these producers to actually supply the specific demands of consumers, and secondarily to actually create industrial linkages with agricultural manufacturing or with agricultural output as well. And this is where things start to sort of, I would say, fray a bit. The second key takeaway is that the choice of early producers, first in Uganda and then very soon after in Tanzania, to focus specifically on the production of basic gray cotton cloth makes complete sense. If we look at the demand patterns in the 1940s and 1950s. So we can see that in 1946, gray cloth alone accounted for 30% of all imports of cloth. However, things start to change pretty rapidly by the 1960s, when suddenly much more sophisticated cotton textiles are starting to gain traction. And we see the biggest shift of all is the rise of synthetic cloth, which accounted in 1946 for only 2% of imports into East Africa of cloth. And by 1963 has basically displaced gray cotton cloth, with 37% of cloth coming into East Africa made up of synthetics. So this is gaining really immense popularity very, very quickly. And in fact, we can see in a report from the East African Common Services Organization from 1963 that it's quite clear that the production of so-called gray goods, gray cloth, in East Africa, we can see here the local product, which is in the portion below on the figure, is already starting to head toward market saturation. So we're going to have a problem here for domestic producers. There is not an increase in demand, but there is an increase in local production. If we compare this in the same report to the situation with synthetics, we see that there is really considerable scope for synthetic producers in East Africa to exploit a massive growing market for synthetic cloth. So I think here it becomes very important at what moment in time these countries are establishing their textile industries. When Uganda began to establish its first mills in the 1950s, and Tanzania soon after, the information was simply not there, that synthetics were basically where you should put your energy. Meanwhile, Kenya only begins producing cloth at the start of the 60s, so they have the benefit of choosing to focus on production in textile sectors where there is really significant demand. So that is a sort of background to why these choices were made at the kind of initial moment when industries are being set up. The sort of second component that I want to explore in this research project is how these choices affected industrial development and competition between these states in the longer term. And here I think this is probably really moving beyond the sort of scope of African consumerism. But since I have 45 minutes, I figured I would share my initial ideas on this. So there are 5 components that I think are very important to consider here, but I'm going to just sort of limit myself in this talk to the first 3. The first is, how do these choices, these national specializations to focus on synthetics versus cotton, affect the capacity to supply your domestic and potentially regional East African market? The second question focuses on how this is going to affect the interplay between East African community member states, and how does it kind of relate to this choice of the East African community to break down after in 1977. And then third, I kind of want to very briefly touch on the role of input supplies here. What does it mean to focus on synthetic production when you do not produce synthetics within your own country and have to import them, versus cotton production when you are an agricultural supplier of raw cotton? So I will sort of quickly go through these 3 sort of, I think, interesting implications. So the first is supplying domestic demand. As you can imagine, the mills that focused on producing gray cotton cloth are going to struggle immensely in the 1960s, and this is exactly what happens. So in a letter from the Development Finance Corporation of Kenya, it's noted that all cotton mills in East Africa are producing grays and are competing in a virtually static market for this cloth. As the African consumer's income rises, the trend is toward more sophisticated textiles and synthetics. It had not been appreciated that the swing would come so rapidly. So this is sort of the rug almost being kind of pulled out from under them. There's also surprise that the main producer, Nitil, which was this first licensed manufacturer in Uganda, would choose not to diversify production immediately when it became apparent that local overproduction, and instead they chose to engage in a price war. And it's important to note that the drastic price reductions did not increase the market. So essentially, they are betting on consumers wanting to purchase their goods if they lower prices, and this simply does not work out. So Uganda and Tanzania, in kind of a state of desperation, basically attempt to boost their ailing textile industries by imposing almost complete restrictions on the import of gray unbleached cloth into East Africa. You can see here in the table that between 1963 and 1967, we have a massive reduction in what is allowed to come into East Africa. But this is only met by a further decrease in demand by consumers, as their consumer preferences are sort of rapidly shifting away from this colonial era emphasis on unbleached cloth toward much more sophisticated garments. And it's noted that there's decreased demand. Consumers are restricting their demand where only these locally produced textiles are available, and that local manufacturers are basically stuck with these large stocks of gray cloth that they simply cannot sell. So essentially, ignoring consumer demand patterns is absolutely catastrophic for them. Now, we know that the large producers of gray unbleached cotton in Uganda and Tanzania are struggling. But then the question is, did Kenyan producers necessarily fare better, given that they are focusing on synthetic cloth, which is supposed to be in such great demand? Um, Based on sort of initial sources, it seems to me that they are also struggling. So I have a quote here, for example, and we have to consider the source. This is from a manufacturer in Kenya who says, our people and traders are still greatly fascinated by imported stuff. They will not easily see the worth in made in Kenya, their fascination for imported goods being so deeply rooted. If restrictions are completely imposed, of course, always the request, on all sorts of imported ready-made garments, our industry will not only flourish enormously, but attain very high reputation abroad. So if it is true that Kenya was also struggling to compete with imported textiles, why would this be the case? Does it have something to do with higher prices of domestic textiles, so a sort of efficiency issue, or maybe a lower quality of the products that they're producing? I mean, these are startup industries. But what I'm also kind of curious to explore is if there is sort of this lasting preference for imports that arose during the colonial era. So I think that that's something that needs a little bit more of an exploration. So moving on to the sort of second component that I'm interested in, and that is the competition between the East African community states that arises as a result of Kenyan textiles being relatively more in demand throughout East Africa than the textiles that Uganda and Tanzania are producing because of these decisions that they made on the basis of very old demand patterns. And I'll say that while the East African community was imposing bans on imports from abroad, there is going to be just loads of infighting that erupts between East African community partners as Uganda and Tanzania become so concerned with the greater success of Kenyan producers. So in 1967, so very early on, a transfer tax is imposed, which basically enables the less industrially developed states, Kenya and Uganda, to impose very heavy transfer taxes, which technically speaking should only be imposed on goods that are not produced in your own country. But this was expanded to basically all types of cloth that were produced in Kenya. And this is, of course, going to cause a great deal of strife among Kenyan producers as they quickly lose access to Ugandan and Tanzanian markets because their prices go way up. So we see in letters written to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry that these producers are really very concerned. So they point out, ever since these restrictions were imposed, our condition is deteriorating daily. We have a story here of producing goods that were specifically designed for consumers in Tanzania. When no restrictions had been imposed, suddenly the goods are ready, and we are refused to send our goods to Tanzania. And they point out something interesting that I think has implications for the sort of free movement of goods and how that might help boost industry throughout the East African community. They point out that each of the three countries are producing certain types of goods which are not necessarily used by the producer country, but are used by the other, and that any restriction on their movement will only hamper encouragement of local industry. So these sort of industrial jealousies between the countries may be sort of hampering production in all three. And it's also asked again and again and again that if these impositions are going to be put in place, then the Kenyan government needs in turn to also put more protective measures in place to protect local manufacturers. Things sort of spiral out of control over the next 10 years or so. And the situation sort of continues to unravel between East African members for admittedly a kind of variety of reasons, including these very different economic and political ideologies, but also this relatively greater success of the Kenyan economy in various industrial pursuits, including textiles, ultimately does play a role in undermining cooperation with neighboring states. So what ends up happening is in 1977, Tanzania entirely closes its borders to trade with Kenya, and the East African community is shortly thereafter completely disbanded. In Kenya, the government responds to this situation, this sort of like chaotic situation, by appeasing the demands of domestic manufacturers for more stringent import bans. But what manufacturers want banned depends entirely on their position in the production chain, which leads to just terrible chaos. So for example, spinning mills want bans on imported yarn, but they want, of course, access to imported materials, whereas textile mills want yarn banned, but they do, or want yarn imports allowed, but they do want bans on imported fabrics. Garment makers want access to the imported fabrics, but they want bans on all garments. And the huge mills that are completely integrated want bans on virtually everything. Meanwhile, East African consumers simply want affordable clothing that meets changing consumer tastes. And in the case of Kenya, where synthetics had this head start, serving those consumer demands with domestic production alone may have been relatively more plausible than in Uganda and Tanzania, which are basically only, for the most part, producing these goods that are no longer really in demand. But sort of how these chaotic policies in the period after the East African community disbanded is something that is sort of a next step in my research. So the very last thing that I want to mention, sort of within the context of these bans on all sorts of things, including industrial inputs, I want to reflect a little bit on how this choice to focus on cotton manufacturing or to place your emphasis on synthetics can affect the relationship between industrial production and stimulating agricultural production, and how this in turn can have an influence on the ability of your industry to succeed. So in sort of general terms, it seems that Kenya benefited from this choice to focus on synthetics rather than these sort of lower order cotton goods. But there is one sort of, I think, considerable problem with this, and that is input supplies. So if we have a look at the yarn requirements in Kenya versus what the local mills are able to supply, we see a considerable problem here. They are having a lot of difficulty getting their hands on synthetic materials produced by local suppliers. This would not be much of a problem if there were not bans placed on the import of yarns. Meanwhile, we know that in Uganda and Tanzania, there is this considerable supply of raw cotton. So it means that the domestic textile industry in Kenya essentially had little opportunity to provide backward linkages to rural agricultural communities, whereas this was much more feasible in the case of Tanzania and Uganda. So this is also, I think, something to keep in mind. So as I mentioned, this is very preliminary, a lot of different sort of strands in this research. And so what I can sort of come to at this point, as I'm kind of exploring this, are a series, I would say, of observations. So first of all, I think that colonial developments in consumer demand and agricultural production had very strong influences on the decisions and the ability to be competitive of post-colonial states. So we can almost see this as a sort of industrial path dependency that arises out of the colonial period. And this is something that I think I would really like to focus on for the book chapter. I think another very key element here is that consumer interests are so often overlooked in policy, but consumers are really perhaps the most powerful stakeholder when we are talking about early industrial development. And finally, I think that there are sort of nuanced benefits and drawbacks of focusing on synthetics. So a focus on cotton manufacturing might handicap producers in the context of an economy where consumer tastes are changing, but it might also ease input supplies and actually create stronger links with domestic agriculture, which is really one of the key goals when we're talking about ISI. So this is my sort of preliminary work, and I am within time.
Yes, thank you very much, Kate, for keeping the time and for this very interesting presentation. I have myself some questions and one comment, but I will first open the floor to see if the audience has questions or comments. Giacomo first.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the paper. No, I'm just wondering, and perhaps this is an unfair question, given that you're an economic historian, but maybe the adoption of some cultural perspectives might come in handy to understand some of the dynamics you're dealing with. Both, say, the preference for synthetics over unbleached, and also the preference for imported over internally produced. Because to what extent, say, were the latter, I mean, to what extent were imported synthetics associated with, I don't know, modernity, say? So basically, I suppose the adoption of some cultural perspectives might take you a bit closer to the true drivers of consumer interest and taste. That's more like a suggestion, really.
No, I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I completely agree. And I am not one of these economic historians who thinks that culture should not play a role, or doesn't. I do think it does, because there is that sort of that bit of a puzzle piece that Kenya, in theory, should be doing really well, and the synthetics they're producing should be very popular, but they're still struggling to attract consumers. So it's true. I mean, it's a question of, is there still a sort of association with imports as being sort of more valuable, right? Sort of a show of sophistication. I definitely think that would be a very important element to bring in. And it's also sort of probably a fundamental problem in general with ISI if this sort of cultural component is really ingrained.
Yes.
Other questions from the audience? Okay, so I can make my questions, and then if there are other questions, they can come later. So thank you again for the paper, Kate. I have one question on the types of cloth that were produced in the early post-colonial period. We had I think it was not the last presentation, but the one before the last, by Jeremy Prestold that you mentioned, and it talked about a lot about the kanga production in the post-colonial period and how in Tanzania and Kenya, I mean, the production of kanga local production of kanga replaced the imports from different parts of the world. They talked a lot about Japan, so I was wondering how the production of kanga, local production of kanga, fits in your story, and what part of kanga heads, I mean, in the local production, considering how important it was as a consumer good in both Tanzania and Kenya. Second question, just for clarification, how these post-colonial national industries were organized in terms of capital and labor. So I imagine that in Tanzania, these were nationalized after the Arusha Declaration. So capital was local, but I was wondering if in Kenya and Uganda it was different. I saw that let one document you show one piece of correspondence that the author was clearly an Indian Ugandan, and so I was wondering, I mean, if you see differences in this sense, also in terms of labor, particularly if women were employed in these factories in the production of textiles. And the last thing is more a general comment, because while we were talking about consumer preferences in the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial period, and the link between this, this long-term perspective, it came to my mind that, what links these three periods over the long term is the existence of a common market that in the pre-colonial period was the one related to the long-distance trade, the export of ivory and slave and that connected Tanzania with Uganda and Kenya and part of the Eastern Congo as well. The colonial period, this common market was created by the fact that these three now nations, at the time colonies, were colonized by the British, so imports were regulated by the British. And finally, the post-colonial period and the East African community, the attempt to a common market that collapsed. And I think that these three periods of common markets were all characterized by the circulation of textiles in the period, the Americani one that was later replaced by Indian cloth and British cloth, and of course the local production that you have studied in your work, so local Tanzanian production. In the British colonial period, the imports and all the regulations that the British put on the imports of textiles that Jeremy Prestold, I think, will talk about in the chapter in the edited volume. And finally, what you have talked about today, so in the post-colonial period, national production. So I was wondering if this could be a way to bring into your story more the 19th century and the connection with the 20th century with this, long-term perspective, a common market made by the textiles, because textiles since the 19th century have always been the main import and in East Africa. And as you show, it was something that national independent countries really focused on in the first decades after independence, when they started to create this East Africa community. So sorry, it was very long, but I think it was really interesting. It made me thinking about this very long history of attempts for common markets that collapsed in the 1970s, actually.
Yeah, so I suppose going in reverse, I think it's a great idea to use the sort of the common market as a sort of theme here. What are the challenges that it faces, and how does it become, I would say, the most challenging at a point when you have these three new countries actually really actively competing with one another. This is where you really see, I would call it sort of the final breakdown of the common market that has been developing really since the pre-colonial period. So I think that's a very interesting way to sort of think about it. And it helps to kind of justify a bit the focus also on these dynamics between the states in the post-colonial period in a volume that is really supposed to be about the 19th century. So I think it's a good sort of tangible link.
Yeah, but we are extending, the period to the 18th and 20th century because we have contributions that, of course.
Okay, good. That's good to hear.
Yeah. So no problem at all. It was just that I think it is really there when you think about East Africa, this idea of a common market and the borders, colonial borders and the national borders, and how this changes things to some extent. Yeah, but not totally, or not in a totalizing way. Yeah.
No, I think it's a very good point. The second question about capital and labor. Yes, this is very different between the different cases. And I think perhaps most important, the role of capital. And this also goes actually into one of the questions that I think is very important and I'm interested in looking into when you think about the different types of textile manufacturing that are occurring. Synthetic manufacture requires a lot of capital intensity. It is a higher level form of manufacturing, basically. And you also have in the case of Kenya that there is a general greater openness to foreign investment. Yes, Kenya is closing its borders, so it's not, we couldn't really classify it as liberal, but in terms of investment from abroad, it's very open. So you end up seeing a lot of investors coming in from the UK, from Germany, from Japan. You, of course, also have loads of domestic investment from Indians who have been, in Kenya since the colonial period. And so I would say that in that sense, despite the fact that Kenya at a point really tries to sort of Africanize its industry, the industry is very heavily underpinned by foreign capital. And sometimes what you see in the correspondences with government is that that influences the agenda of these manufacturers who are very often less interested in sort of the Kenyan industrial project and more interested in figuring out how to produce as low cost as possible and extract as much wealth as they can. So there's a bit of a, let's say, neo-colonialism going on there. Whereas, of course, in the case of Tanzania, especially after the Arusha Declaration, it is much more domestically oriented in terms of production. The question about women's involvement in manufacturing, unfortunately, I don't know. I haven't really been able to see sort of firm level analyses, so I'm not sure about who exactly was being employed. I think the question about the role of Conga is super important, and it makes me very sad that I missed Jeremy's talk, because I think I have also heard that in Tanzania there is a rise in domestic production of Conga. I think it becomes quite popular at a point. I don't know when that happens, though. I'm not sure if it's already taking place in this very early period. So I would be very interested to talk with Jeremy about this, because depending on how the conga is being produced, it could be a very valuable way to use unbleached cloth if it's being printed, and it is a relatively, let's say, I wouldn't call it low skill, but it is a task that can be done without an immense amount of capital investment. So this could be a sort of, yeah, turning point in the possibilities of these cotton manufacturers if they sort of smartly think how they can serve domestic demands. So more to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. More questions from the audience?
Yes, may I ask a question? Kate, thank you very much for your presentation. And I was thinking a little bit at the long term. Now, my experience goes to the Horn of Africa. I'm not an expert of Eastern Africa. I mean, my question is from my experience. If we compare the 19th and the 20th century, if we compare colonial period and post-colonial period, what is interesting to see is the fact that alongside consumers, the difference in the post-colonial period is that we have also not only local consumer, but we have also local entrepreneur. No? I mean, we have people that enter the business. We have businessmen, African businessmen that start working. It is true that the textile probably is the worst place to notice this phenomenon. But anyway, around the textile, you have a lot of other industries or workshops that are offering services to the textile sector, no? And there is where you can find local entrepreneur, no? I mean, African businessmen. So my question basically was about the presence of this new protagonist in the economic life of the African countries. That is the local businessman, the local entrepreneur. If you can see it in your research, I mean, because, for example, from my experience, it was really very interesting to meet some of them and to interview some of these old local entrepreneur, probably one of the first, I mean, belonging to the first generation of African businessmen. So I was curious to know also if during your research you came across to this phenomenon.
I have not, because exactly as you say, it is really in the textile industry that it is very difficult for Africans to sort of get their foot in the door. My guess would be you would probably find, if we're looking for sort of associated fields, you might find more tailors coming into play as they, you're making actual garments. But I haven't specifically seen this in my research, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Just to add on to that, I think in my case, I would just say more of ordinary people, coming into the story. Just to build on what Massimo said. And then secondly, I wonder if it's just the textile. What are other these things that interact with textile,
Mm-hmm.
And I think they have to come into play. I'm just thinking, I could be wrong here. Things like the beads and other things. How do they come together? Because if it gets to clothing, and the consumers are, understanding it in a much broader way. We're just calling it textile, but to them it might actually be in a much broader way that other things also come up. Maybe it's also influencing the beads industry. What are some of these things that are coming as a result of the textile? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think you mean sort of like the almost like broader fashion industry, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's sort of yeah, I mean, I think this also goes a bit back to the first question about more of the sort of cultural dynamics at play here. How is the kind of culture of the consumer changing, or are there components that are sort of staying intact, like this idea that that one of the producers was saying that our people have a fascination with imported materials. Is this something that is sort of persistent? Is it something that's changing over time? But also the kind of, and I think this also goes back to what Karin has said about the role of domestically produced conga. Is there a sort of local, let's say fashion industry that is emerging that needs these domestically produced textiles to make it happen? So I think it all sort of comes back to the question of the culture of the consumer and how that is shifting.
Giorgio?
Okay, thank you very much. I learned a lot of things. I had two questions. The first one concerns the consumer culture, and I wanted to ask if some of the governments involved try to make a conscious effort to change the consumption patterns, like, I don't know, propaganda campaign to say buy Kenyan or buy I don't know, great clothes instead of the modern stuff and so on. And then another question is if in the medium run, there's maybe a difference in the performance of the factories that produce yarn and those that produce the actual clothes.
So it's sort of a follow-up question. What do you mean by a difference between them? Like a difference in
If some of them are actually more successful, if you can see that maybe, I don't know, the Ugandan factories that produce only yarn actually make to survive, and it's the problems are only concentrated in those that actually make the cloth, or vice versa, or maybe there isn't, and maybe all the factories are factories that produce both things, and so you cannot really say a difference. But maybe there is actually a different story.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I can sort of approach it from a, let's say, a sort of backward way. What I do know is that when all of these sort of bans between the countries are starting to be put in place, there is immense concern by the actual textile producers, so those who are making the cloth, that they will not have the necessary access to yarn. So I do absolutely think that yarn manufacturers, I mean, they're so key to the entire process, and the types of cloth that you can produce with yarn are more varied. So I think that there's probably something to that. I can't say for sure that yarn producers were simply more successful than textile producers, but I would say, based on a hunch, and the high demand for yarn and concerns about border closures, that is probably the case. Propaganda campaigns, that's a very good question, and I think if you think about the sort of colonial past of Buy British, I would not be surprised, but I haven't come across it. But I will definitely look into that. What I do know is that in newspaper articles, there's sort of like these sort of like vociferous statements that we need to ban imports. So there is definitely a sort of, let's call it an industrial nationalism. I don't know about a sort of advertising campaign for consumers, but I think that I will definitely look into that.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from the audience? We still have some time.
I think we should let Kate go and collect her daughter or son or children or whatever.
My son.
Son, sorry, okay.
Okay, so if there are no more questions or comments, I think we can close the seminar here. But we will, of course, have more chances to discuss the paper in September at the workshop in Bologna. And of course, the paper will become part of the edited volume. Yes, you will be all contacted soon by the administration here in Bologna to book the flights and for the organization. I hope, well, next week they will be in touch. And I would like to remind you the next seminar that is going to be in 2 weeks, I think. I don't have my agenda here. Alessandro, have you got the calendar at hand?
So the next seminar will be on the 6th of June.
The 6th of June, yeah.
Yes.
So in time.
Yeah, and it will be Anne Ruderman presenting on Venetian beads for the Atlantic slave trade.
Yes, yes. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you again very much, Kate, for presenting your paper and for being with us today. And yeah, we will chat soon and see ourselves in Bologna in September.
Yep. And thank you very much for all of your very nice questions.
Thank you.